My name is Emily Carter, and I never thought the first betrayal I would uncover in my own family would come at the expense of someone who couldn't defend themselves, my golden retriever, Max. I loved him more than anything, but when he suddenly died, my father dismissed it as just old age. The truth, revealed by the vet's autopsy, showed something much darker, something my stepmother desperately tried to hide. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It's strange how family can shift overnight. One day, you're safe, held in a rhythm of routine and trust, and the next, you're staring into a silence so heavy it feels like betrayal itself is sitting at the dinner table with you. I was 17 when everything happened, living in a small suburban town in Oregon with my dad, my stepmother Claire, and Max. My mom had passed away when I was 8, and while I never stopped missing her, Max had been my anchor through the storms. He was my shadow, my comfort, and the one soul I could always rely on. When my dad remarried Claire 2 years earlier, I tried to be open-minded. She was polished in a way my mom never had been. Expensive clothes, immaculate makeup even when she went to the grocery store, and a tone of voice that always carried a subtle edge, like every word was measured to remind you she was the smartest person in the room. She never outright said she didn't like Max, but I could see it in the way she avoided petting him, or how she cringed whenever his fur brushed against the couch she kept spotless. Dad would laugh it off, saying she just wasn't a dog person. But to me, Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. The night before it all began, I remember lying on the living room carpet with Max, scratching behind his ears as he sighed contentedly. He had always been so full of life, bounding toward the door whenever I came home from school, tail wagging like a metronome of joy. That evening, though, he seemed tired. His eyes drooped more than usual, and when I offered him one of his favorite treats, he sniffed it but turned his head away. "Maybe he's just not hungry," Dad said when I mentioned it, dismissive as ever. Claire simply raised her eyebrows in that way she did, a half smile tugging at her lips that always made me feel like she knew something I didn't. The next morning, Max wouldn't get up. His breathing was shallow, his paws twitching like he was trying to run in his sleep but couldn't. I panicked, shaking him gently, calling his name over and over. By the time we got him to the vet, his heartbeat was faint, and just an hour later, he was gone. My world collapsed. Tears blurred everything, and I could barely hear the vet's soft condolences. Dad's arm went around my shoulders, stiff, uncomfortable, like he was just doing what he thought he should. "He was old, Em," he said firmly, as though saying it with conviction would somehow erase my grief. "These things happen. It's nature." But something gnawed at me. Max wasn't that old. 7 years wasn't old age for a golden retriever. And more than that, he'd been fine until recently, healthy, playful, eating well. The sudden decline didn't make sense. As I sat in the car with the scent of antiseptic still clinging to my clothes, Claire spoke up for the first time. "Maybe this is for the best," she said quietly, her voice smooth as silk but with a trace of something sharper beneath it. "Now you can focus on your future without distractions." A distraction. That's what she thought Max was. The words burned into my mind, leaving me both heartbroken and suspicious. I stared out the window the whole drive home, silent tears streaming down my face, replaying every recent moment in my head. Max's sudden refusal of food, his tired eyes, Claire's disdainful glances whenever he entered the room, and the way she always seemed to take over the kitchen, even insisting that she prepare Max's meals when I wasn't around. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet without Max's soft breathing at the foot of my bed. I thought about my dad's words about nature, but it didn't feel right. Something inside me, an instinct I couldn't ignore, kept whispering that this wasn't natural at all. I remembered the way she had smiled faintly when Dad said it was old age, how quickly she moved on, pouring herself a glass of wine and turning on the television like the loss didn't matter. The next day, still hollow with grief, but now fueled with a gnawing suspicion, I called the vet back. My voice trembled as I asked if they could do an autopsy. The receptionist hesitated. Most families didn't request that for pets, but when she heard the strain in my voice, she agreed to speak to the doctor. I didn't tell Dad. I knew he would say it was a waste of time and that I was just clinging to something because I couldn't accept the truth. And Claire, I didn't even want to imagine her reaction. This was something I had to do on my own. That night, I sat in the living room of our family home, the city lights of Cedarbrook twinkling through the window, and replayed the conversation over and over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Dad was thoughtful, deliberate, rarely impulsive. He wasn't the type to make decisions on a whim. And yet, this decision seemed sudden, almost out of character. I began to wonder if there was more to the story, something in the paperwork, some clause in the partnership agreement, some secret Dad had been holding back all these years. The thought both terrified and intrigued me. Could it be that this wasn't just favoritism or a misguided opinion, but something far more deliberate? Something that might change everything I thought I knew about my family and the business? As I lay awake that night, my mind buzzing, I realized that this was only the beginning. Whatever the reason behind Dad's decision, I couldn't let it stand unexamined. I needed to know why Ryan, of all people, had been chosen. And as I glanced at the corner of the coffee table, where the old partnership documents lay forgotten, I felt a flicker of determination ignite within me. Maybe I hadn't been chosen, but that didn't mean I was powerless. And somehow, someway, I had a feeling the papers themselves held a truth that Dad hadn't yet shared. The next morning, the office felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension from Dad's announcement. I arrived early, clutching my laptop bag, determined to stay composed even though every nerve in my body was screaming. The employees greeted me with polite smiles, but I could sense the underlying whispers, the subtle shifts in glances, the way Ryan's name now carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. It was as if overnight he had transformed from my brother into the designated heir of everything Dad had built, and I was suddenly relegated to a supporting role. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that I had responsibilities that still mattered, that my work wasn't suddenly invisible just because Dad had made a choice. Yet, deep down, I knew that this was more than a temporary awkwardness. It was the beginning of a shift that would ripple through every corner of the company. I spent the morning reviewing operational reports and financial statements, a task I had performed countless times. But this time, the numbers felt different. Every misstep, every small inefficiency I had corrected, every late-night call to vendors now seemed like proof of my competence that no one would publicly acknowledge. Ryan, of course, walked in around 10, impeccably dressed and exuding that effortless confidence that always drew people in. He greeted me with a casual, "Morning, Emma," as if nothing had changed, and I forced myself to respond with a simple, "Morning," though my hands shook slightly as I tapped through the spreadsheets. It wasn't his demeanor that bothered me. It was the unspoken assumption behind it, that he was now the one in charge, the one whose decisions mattered most, the one whose approval or disapproval carried weight with Dad. As the day wore on, I started noticing patterns I hadn't paid much attention to before. Ryan's meetings with clients were always private, scheduled at times when I would be occupied with internal management. Emails that previously came to both of us were now addressed only to him. Even the team, who had always treated me as an equal partner in operations, seemed to unconsciously defer to him in subtle ways, waiting for his nod or his input before moving forward. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it built a quiet pressure that weighed on me. The more I observed, the more I realized that Dad's decision had not just been about capability, it had been a signal to the entire company that Ryan was the figurehead, the one whose vision would define the future of Callahan Manufacturing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in the storage room, ostensibly checking inventory, but really using it as an excuse to gather my thoughts. Among the shelves of raw materials and shipping boxes, I let my mind wander, replaying every conversation I had ever had with Dad about succession, every late-night discussion about strategy, every suggestion I had made to improve efficiency. I remember thinking that my contributions mattered, that I was being seen and appreciated, even if not publicly praised. And yet,
As I stood there, the pieces began to fall into place. Perhaps I had been operating under an illusion. Maybe Dad's perception of me had always been limited, bounded by his assumptions about who I was, not who I could become. And even if that were true, why had he never communicated it clearly? Why had he allowed me to believe I was in line to take over, only to announce Ryan as the chosen successor so abruptly?
When I returned to my desk, I tried to focus on tangible tasks, invoices, supply orders, employee schedules. But every time my phone buzzed with a message from a client asking for Ryan's input or an internal email routed exclusively to him, I felt a pang of exclusion that cut deeper than I cared to admit. The subtle but persistent undermining of my role wasn't malicious, it was systemic. And the more I observed, the more I realized that this hidden problem, this quiet favoritism, had been embedded in the very structure of the company for years. I had been working diligently within a system that was never truly designed to recognize or reward my leadership. Instead, it had been waiting, silently, for the moment when Ryan could step forward unopposed, while I remained in the shadows. By the afternoon, I decided to speak with Sarah, my closest ally in the office, someone who had been with Callahan Manufacturing for over a decade and understood the family dynamics better than anyone. We sat in the small break room, the hum of the coffee machine filling the silence, as I tried to explain what I was feeling. "Sarah, it's like overnight Ryan's become untouchable," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just that Dad chose him, it's how everything's shifting, how everyone's reacting. I feel like I'm disappearing, like none of the work I've done matters anymore." Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Emma, I've noticed it too. Ryan's charm and Dad's trust in him have always been obvious, but now it's amplified. The team defers to him automatically. It's subtle, but it's real. The system has been leaning this way for a long time. You're not imagining it." Her words stung because they were true. I had been operating under the belief that merit and effort would be recognized, that loyalty and dedication would count for something, but the reality was different. The company wasn't a neutral entity. It had been shaped by Dad's perceptions, by the assumptions he carried about Ryan and me, and by the unspoken hierarchy that existed long before the formal announcement. I realized that this hidden problem, the quiet, systemic favoritism, and the embedded perception of Ryan as the more capable child, wasn't something that could be easily corrected. It was deeply woven into the fabric of both the company and our family. As the day drew to a close, I returned home, exhausted not just from the workload, but from the weight of this realization. In the quiet of my room, I stared at the stack of partnership documents Dad had left on the corner of the desk earlier that week. They hadn't been opened yet, but I could sense that within those pages lay the explanation, or at least a clue, as to why Dad had made his decision. Something told me that understanding the structure of the partnership, the clauses, the percentages, and the conditions might reveal a truth that was hidden not just from me, but from everyone in the company. And with that thought, a determination began to root take. If I was going to reclaim my place, or at least understand why I had been sidelined, I would need to confront this hidden problem head-on. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but I knew that ignoring it wasn't an option. The week after Dad's announcement dragged on like a slow storm. Each day I arrived at Callahan Manufacturing, the invisible line between Ryan and me seemed to widen. He had begun scheduling meetings with clients and vendors without even mentioning me, and whenever I tried to contribute to decisions, it was as if my suggestions were politely acknowledged but quietly ignored. I had always prided myself on my ability to stay composed under pressure, but by midweek, frustration was eating away at my resolve. The breaking point came unexpectedly in the form of a single email that landed in my inbox around noon on Wednesday. It was from one of our biggest clients, Hartford Industries, and it read simply, "We will need Ryan's approval on all contracts moving forward. Thank you for understanding." I stared at the screen for a long moment, unable to comprehend what I was reading. For years, I had managed their account, negotiating contracts, resolving disputes, and building relationships that secured us repeat business. Now, apparently, my years of effort were irrelevant. Ryan, who had barely engaged with the account beyond a brief introductory meeting months ago, was suddenly the gatekeeper, the authority, the person whose signature mattered. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through me. How could Dad's decision, unexplained, unquestioned, change the ground rules of the business overnight? I felt blindsided, betrayed not just by my father's choice, but by the system that allowed my expertise to be dismissed so casually. I decided to confront Ryan directly. I found him in his office, a space that had always been his sanctuary of neatness and comfort, adorned with sleek furniture and his favorite framed photos of college sports victories. "Ryan," I tried to keep my voice steady. "I just got the Hartford email. Why wasn't I informed that you'd be taking over their contracts?" He looked up from his laptop, eyebrows raised, his signature easy smile in place. "Emma, it's nothing personal," he said smoothly. "Dad wants a single point of contact for big clients. It makes things simpler." His tone was casual, almost dismissive, but I could feel the edge of condescension underneath, as though I were a child being politely corrected.
The report in my backpack suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. My throat tightened, and I almost pulled it out right then and there, slammed it on the table, and forced him to read it. But fear held me back. Fear of what it would do to him, fear that even with undeniable proof, he'd find a way to dismiss it, to side with Claire. So instead, I bit my tongue, tears spilling over as I stood up and pushed back from the table. "You don't understand," I whispered, and without waiting for his response, I ran upstairs to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I collapsed onto my bed, shaking, sobs racking my chest. My dad's refusal to see the truth felt like a second betrayal. It wasn't just Claire I was fighting, it was his blindness, his unwillingness to question the woman he loved. For the first time, I felt utterly alone, trapped in a house where the truth was poison itself. That night, as the house grew quiet, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint murmur of Claire's voice drifting up from the living room. She was speaking low, soothing, probably convincing Dad that I was just grieving, unstable, lashing out. And maybe she was right about one thing. I was grieving, but I wasn't unstable. I knew what I knew. Max had been poisoned, and Claire was the only one who stood to gain from his absence. The breaking point wasn't just my outburst at dinner, it was what it left behind in its wake. A decision. I couldn't sit in silence anymore, couldn't let Dad's denial bury the truth along with Max. If I didn't fight for him, no one would. But to fight, I needed allies. Proof wasn't enough if it stayed in my backpack. I had to find someone who would listen, someone who could see what my father refused to see. The morning after I finally confided in Jordan, I felt different walking through the school halls. For weeks, I had been drowning in grief and suspicion, trapped in silence with no one to believe me. But now, at least one person knew the truth. Jordan's outrage had lit something inside me, an ember of courage that refused to be extinguished. Still, courage alone wouldn't be enough. I knew Claire was clever, manipulative, and practiced in disguising herself as the perfect wife. If I wanted to expose her, I would need more than my gut and the vet's report. I needed outside eyes, someone who would see past Claire's performance, someone who couldn't be easily dismissed. That afternoon, Jordan cornered me by my locker. "I've been thinking about this all night," she said, lowering her voice. "You can't keep this between just us. You need someone who can actually do something with it. What about showing the vet's report to an adult you trust?" My stomach tightened. Adults had never really been safe territory for me, not since Dad started acting like my feelings were inconveniences. But Jordan was right. I couldn't take this on alone. After school, instead of heading straight home, I walked to the veterinary clinic again. The autumn air was sharp against my skin, and I gripped the straps of my backpack like they were lifelines. Inside, the receptionist gave me a sympathetic smile. "Emily, back again?" she asked gently. I nodded, my throat dry. I need to talk to Dr. Simmons, please." She gave me a look filled with pity and concern, but led me back to one of the exam rooms, where the vet soon joined me. Dr. Simmons was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a steady voice, the type of person who seemed to carry gravity in everything he said. He sat across from me, folding his hands on the counter. "I'm guessing this is about Max's report," he said softly. My eyes stung at the sound of Max's name, but I nodded and slid the papers out of my bag. "I don't think this was an accident," I whispered. "Someone in my house, someone might have given this to him on purpose."
He studied me for a long moment, his brow furrowing. "Emily, I can't accuse anyone without proof, but what the report shows is clear. This wasn't natural. Someone gave Max rat poison. That's not something dogs accidentally ingest unless it's accessible in the home." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into my chest. He didn't say Claire's name, he didn't have to, but the implication was there. If you truly believe someone harmed Max intentionally, you need to tell your father, or another trusted adult. This isn't something you should shoulder by yourself. His words confirmed what I had known deep down. This was bigger than me, bigger than my grief, bigger than Claire's games. I left the clinic with the report clutched to my chest, feeling as though I was carrying both evidence and a curse. For the first time, I realized that the truth wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about safety. If Claire could do this to him, what was stopping her from doing worse to me if she felt threatened? At home that evening, I tried to act normal, though my nerves buzzed like live wires. Dad was on the couch, flipping through channels, while Claire scrolled through her phone. I thought of Dr. Simmons' advice, the weight of his steady voice telling me to bring an adult into this. I sat down across from Dad, my heart hammering. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice trembling. He muted the TV and looked at me with concern. "Of course, Em. What's on your mind?" For a moment, the words caught in my throat, but then I remembered Max, remembered his limp body in my arms, and the words tumbled out. The vet did an autopsy. Max didn't die of natural causes. He was poisoned. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad blinked, processing, his jaw tightening. Claire froze mid-scroll, her phone lowering ever so slightly. "What?" Dad asked finally, his voice low. "What are you talking about?" I shoved the report into his hands, the papers trembling as he unfolded them. He scanned the lines, his brows knitting together. This says rat poison?" he murmured, disbelief coloring his tone. I glanced at Claire, whose expression shifted rapidly. Shock, confusion, then carefully measured concern. She placed a hand on Dad's arm, her voice dripping with sorrow. "Oh my goodness, poisoned? But how? We don't keep anything like that in the house, do we?" Her performance was flawless, each word calculated, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. But I saw the flicker, just for a second, when her mask slipped, a flash of irritation quickly buried beneath her false worry. I wanted to scream, to point at her and tell Dad everything I had seen, every moment of disdain she had shown Max, but I forced myself to stay calm. Evidence was on my side now. "Dad," I said firmly, my voice steadier than I felt, "this wasn't an accident. Someone gave it to him. Someone who wanted him gone." Dad looked torn, his eyes darting between the report and Claire. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Who would do something like that?" Claire squeezed his arm, her voice honey-sweet. "Maybe a neighbor? You know how some people don't like dogs. Maybe he got into something in the yard." She spoke smoothly, but I knew she was deflecting, pushing the blame anywhere but where it belonged. That moment was the point of no return. Dad didn't dismiss the report, not completely. He couldn't. It was right there in his hands. The seed of doubt had been planted, whether he wanted it or not. Outside eyes, Dr. Simmons, the cold words of the autopsy, had seen the truth. The lies Claire wrapped herself in were starting to fray. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I knew there was no going back. I had brought the truth into the open, even if Dad wasn't ready to accept it fully. Claire knew now that I wasn't blind, that I wouldn't stay silent, and I could feel it in my bones. She wouldn't take that lightly. Something in the air had shifted, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Max's death was no longer a shadow whispered about in my head. It was evidence, undeniable and real.
And now, the walls of lies Claire built around herself were beginning to crack.
By Friday, the first cracks in the cover-up had become undeniable. External eyes, Laura, Greg, the bank representative, had all seen enough to raise questions. Even within the company, employees began to whisper more openly about the shift in authority, and a subtle divide was forming between those loyal to Ryan and those who had recognized my years of contribution. Sitting at my desk late that evening, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The path forward was no longer about proving my capability to Dad or to Ryan alone. It was about confronting a truth that multiple witnesses, both inside and outside the family, were beginning to see for themselves. I knew that once the partnership documents were fully examined and the external evidence aligned with my observations, the hidden story would begin to emerge, and the carefully maintained illusion of natural succession would finally be challenged. After the events of last week, I knew I had entered a new phase, one where passive observation was no longer enough. The realization that external eyes were now on the situation, coupled with the growing whispers inside the office, made it clear that action was necessary. The company was subtly shifting under Ryan's leadership, and if I wanted to reclaim any semblance of control, or at the very least understand the decisions that had been made, I needed hard evidence. I couldn't rely on hearsay or vague impressions. I needed documentation, records, and proof that would stand up to scrutiny. With that thought in mind, I began the painstaking process of gathering every piece of relevant information, knowing that each step carried the risk of exposing my intentions prematurely. I started with the partnership agreement, sifting through dozens of pages that had sat untouched for years in a locked cabinet. With each clause I read, I felt a mix of vindication and disbelief. There were amendments I had never been aware of, subtle changes to voting rights, approval authority, and succession terms that clearly favored Ryan under certain conditions. It was clever, almost too clever, crafted in a way that looked neutral on paper but ensured a preordained outcome. I began highlighting passages, cross-referencing them with recent decisions Ryan had made, and mapping out a timeline of when each shift in authority had occurred. Patterns emerged, revealing a calculated strategy that had been quietly implemented over the past few years. Every document I examined deepened my conviction that this wasn't just favoritism, it was a deliberate orchestration, and I had been kept in the dark. Next, I turned my attention to operational records. I requested archived emails, client approvals, and financial statements dating back several years, going further back than anyone in the office had ever bothered to review. I wanted to establish a pattern, a clear narrative that would withstand questioning from Dad, Ryan, or any external authority. As I sorted through digital folders and paper files, I noticed repeated instances where my contributions were either overlooked or attributed to Ryan in reports sent to upper management or clients. A contract I had negotiated, a supply chain solution I had implemented, or a client issue I had resolved, all subtly reframed as achievements under Ryan's oversight. It was infuriating to see, but also incredibly valuable as evidence. For the first time, I had concrete proof that my role had been intentionally minimized while Ryan was being positioned as the leading figure. I wasn't alone in my efforts. Sarah and Greg became critical allies, providing insights and corroborating information that strengthened the narrative I was building. Sarah, with her years of experience on the floor, offered observations about how employees were subtly encouraged to defer to Ryan's authority. She recounted specific incidents where my instructions were ignored or delayed until Ryan intervened, providing the appearance that his leadership was both necessary and more competent. Greg, meanwhile, meticulously reviewed financial records, highlighting decisions where Ryan's name had been inserted as approver or signatory without my knowledge. Together, we began piecing together a timeline of manipulation, subtle, yet undeniable, and each revelation added weight to the growing case I was constructing. Yet the more evidence I gathered, the more I felt the tension mounting. Ryan remained oblivious to our efforts, but I could sense that subtle changes in behavior were rippling through the office. Some employees began hesitating before automatically deferring to him. Questions were raised in private conversations about why certain decisions were bypassing me. Even external contacts, from clients to consultants, noticed the shift and occasionally sought clarification directly from me. Each inquiry was an opportunity and a risk, an opportunity to present facts and demonstrate competence, a risk that Ryan or Dad might sense my growing scrutiny and react defensively. The mounting pressure was also internal.
Every day, I had to balance my usual responsibilities, managing operations, handling client issues, and ensuring the business ran smoothly with the clandestine investigation I had embarked on. It was exhausting mentally and emotionally to navigate the dual realities, the day-to-day demands of the company and the hidden mission of uncovering the truth. I had to be cautious not to alert Ryan to my activities while still pushing forward aggressively enough to build a compelling case. Every document I scanned, every email I copied, every testimony I recorded had to be carefully logged and organized because a single mistake could compromise the entire effort.
Meanwhile, Claire's behavior grew bolder. One evening, as I came downstairs for a glass of water, I caught her in the kitchen, standing perfectly still in the dim light, staring out the window with a glass of wine in hand. She didn't flinch when I entered. Instead, she turned to me slowly, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, Emily," she said softly, "dogs come and go, but family is forever. It's better not to dwell on the past." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and for the first time I felt she wasn't just hinting, she was warning me. I retreated upstairs, clutching my phone like a weapon. The evidence I was gathering might have been growing, but so was her awareness that I wasn't fooled. We were locked in a silent war, each of us waiting for the other to make the next move, and with every passing day, the stakes grew higher. By then, I understood one thing with chilling clarity. Claire wasn't going to stop. She had already erased Max. Now she wanted to erase my suspicion, my resistance, and if I wasn't careful, she might succeed. The tension inside our house had grown unbearable, and by the time the weekend rolled around, I could barely stand to be in the same room as Claire without my chest tightening. Every interaction felt like a chess match, her words carefully chosen, her movements deliberate, while I scrambled to stay one step ahead. Dad remained caught in the middle, leaning on denial as his shield, but I could see the cracks forming in him too. He wasn't as quick to laugh at her jokes anymore, and sometimes when he thought no one was looking, his eyes held that same uncertainty I felt. Still, denial was easier for him than facing what I knew was true. But everything changed on Saturday evening when undeniable proof fell into my hands and destroyed any illusion that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. Claire had announced earlier that day that she was going to make her special lasagna for dinner, a recipe she loved bragging about to her friends. I didn't care much for it, but Dad adored it, so I stayed out of the way while she worked in the kitchen, occasionally hearing her hum to herself or clink pans together. I was in the living room with my homework spread across the coffee table when I heard her phone buzz on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't have cared, but something about the way she immediately rushed from the stove to grab it caught my attention. She glanced over her shoulder, checking if anyone was watching, then tapped quickly on the screen, her expression sharpening into something cold. I stayed still, pretending to read, but my mind was spinning. A few minutes later, when she went upstairs, probably to change before dinner, I slipped into the kitchen. Her phone wasn't there anymore, but I noticed something else that froze me in place. On the far corner of the counter, half hidden beneath a folded dish towel, was that same small container I'd found before, the one with the rodent side. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear as I stepped closer. The lid was off this time. Beside it was a small mixing bowl with cheese and herbs. My stomach dropped as realization crashed over me. She had been preparing the lasagna with poison nearby. Whether she intended to use it on us or it was just negligence didn't matter. The intent was there. The danger was real. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. With the camera open, I recorded everything. The container, the pellets inside, the bowl, the counter where she had placed them. I whispered the date, the time, describing what I was seeing, just like I had done before. Then, terrified she might come back any second, I tucked the container back beneath the towel, careful to leave it exactly as I had found it. That night, I barely touched my plate. Dad ate heartily, complimenting Claire on her cooking, while she beamed at him with that same rehearsed glow that always made my skin crawl. My fork lingered over the pasta, pushing the noodles around without taking a single bite. When Claire noticed, her eyes lingered on me for a second too long. "Not hungry, Emily?" she asked sweetly. I forced a smile. "Just tired from studying."
She tilted her head, her lips curving into that smile that I hated, as if she knew I was lying, as if she was daring me to keep pretending.
Even as I felt the thrill of finally understanding the full scope of the situation, a part of me recoiled at the implications. Dad had orchestrated this transition with precision, perhaps believing it was in the company's best interest. Ryan had stepped into the role seamlessly, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the meticulous planning behind his rise. I felt a mixture of admiration for the strategy and resentment for the manipulation. The undeniable proof had changed everything. It removed ambiguity, it removed doubt, and it removed excuses. There was no longer a place to rationalize the decision as a simple matter of perception or miscommunication. The truth was stark, clear, and unavoidable. Ryan's authority was built on a foundation that had quietly sidelined me. Late that evening, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the evidence for the 100th time. I realized that the midpoint had shifted the story irrevocably. What had begun as a personal conflict, feeling overlooked and undervalued, had now transformed into a structural revelation that demanded confrontation. I could no longer pretend that the old way of coping, quiet competence, silent dedication, would suffice. The undeniable proof had made the stakes clear. The narrative could not remain hidden, and the coming confrontation was inevitable. I felt a mixture of fear, anger, and determination crystallize into resolve. The truth was undeniable, and soon it would have to be confronted by everyone involved. The sense of inevitability weighed heavily on me. The evidence wasn't just a personal vindication. It was a force that would demand action, responses, and ultimately choices. Allies within the company, external consultants, and even Dad himself would be confronted with facts that could no longer be ignored. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of clarity. I knew that the coming days would test not just my professional acumen, but my courage, my patience, and my ability to navigate the emotional minefield that lay ahead. The undeniable proof was no longer a secret. It was a catalyst, a turning point, and a point of no return in a story that began quietly but was about to explode into the open. The undeniable proof had shifted everything. For days, I replayed the discoveries in my mind, weighing every possible consequence of revealing the truth. Sitting alone in the quiet of my office, I felt the tension in my chest tighten with each passing hour. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or quiet resentment. The evidence in my hands demanded action. I had a choice: remain silent, allowing the meticulous orchestration of Ryan's rise to continue unchallenged, or speak out, confront the reality, and force the company and my family to acknowledge what had been hidden in plain sight. The weight of that decision was immense. Speaking up would undoubtedly spark conflict, perhaps even sever relationships, but remaining quiet felt like betrayal to myself, to the employees who had silently witnessed my efforts, and to the integrity of the company I had nurtured alongside Dad for years. It began with a series of quiet conversations with Sarah and Greg. I laid out the evidence, step by step, from the subtle amendments in the partnership agreement to the email trails and internal memos that documented Ryan's marginalization of my role. Sarah leaned forward, her expression grave. She said, "Emma, this is explosive. Once you speak, there's no going back. People will have to choose sides. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded, the answer instinctive. I had reached the point where inaction was no longer an option. The truth had revealed itself in black and white, undeniable and unarguable. I could continue to let it be ignored, or I could take a stand and force the narrative to align with reality. The choice, difficult as it was, had been made. I would speak. The first step was to confront Dad directly. He had always been the heart and mind of Callahan Manufacturing, the architect of the company's vision, and the one who had ultimately shaped Ryan's path. I needed to understand not only why the transition occurred as it did, but also whether the orchestration was intentional or inadvertent. When I walked into Dad's office that morning, I carried a folder of carefully organized documents, the evidence I had meticulously compiled. He looked up from his papers, smiling briefly, unaware of the storm about to be unleashed. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Dad,
I need to talk to you about the company and about Ryan's recent promotion, I said, my voice firm but measured. His smile faltered slightly, replaced by a shadow of concern, and I knew that he immediately sensed the gravity of my words. I presented the evidence calmly, step by step. I showed him the partnership amendment, the emails, the memos, and the financial records. I highlighted the patterns that clearly favored Ryan while marginalizing my contributions. I watched as his expression shifted from mild surprise to a subtle tightness around his eyes, the recognition that this was more than a simple complaint dawning on him. "Emma," he said finally, his voice low, "I didn't realize. I thought I had been fair, but I see now that this has been hidden from you and perhaps even from me in some ways." His words were measured, almost defensive, but there was an undertone of acknowledgement. For the first time, Dad was confronted with the structural reality of Ryan's rise, and the implications were unavoidable.
Claire's expression flickered, a shadow crossing her face before she masked it with a tight smile. "The truth?" she asked, lightly. "Oh, Emily, sometimes the truth is too heavy for little girls to carry. Don't you think it's better to leave it alone?" She stepped closer, her presence imposing, and my stomach sank. I realized she wasn't just deflecting anymore. She was testing me, sizing me up, seeing if she could intimidate me into silence. At that moment, I knew something critical. If I stayed silent, I would be complicit. Max's death would be just another tragic story, buried under lies and careful manipulation. Claire had power in this house, but that power depended on my silence and Dad's reluctance to confront her. I could no longer remain quiet. The choice was mine: protect myself by keeping the truth hidden, or risk everything to speak it, to demand accountability. The very next morning, I found Dad in the garage fixing a leaky pipe, his hands smeared with grease. He looked up as I approached, sensing my intent before I even spoke. "Dad, I need to tell you something," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. He nodded, setting down the wrench, wiping his hands with a rag. "Go ahead, Emily." I told him everything, not holding back. The video, the rodenticide container, the way Claire had prepared food in its presence, the pattern of disdain and subtle cruelty I had witnessed for months. My voice quivered only once when I described finding Max struggling on the living room floor, his eyes full of confusion and trust, the very trust that had been betrayed. Dad's face changed with each word, his expression darkening, his lips pressed into a thin line. When I finished, he was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Emily, this is serious." The tremor in his tone betrayed the turmoil beneath. I didn't want to believe it, but this is real." He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "We need to handle this carefully. You've done the right thing by coming to me first." Hearing him acknowledge the truth, even partially, gave me a surge of courage, but it was tempered by the reality that Claire's reaction would be swift and calculating. And I didn't have to wait long to see just how far she would go. That evening, she cornered me in the living room as I tried to study. "Emily," she said, her tone sweet but edged with something cold, "I hear you've been spreading rumors about me. That's not nice. You should be careful about what you say." She smiled, her lips tight, and I saw it then, her mask slipping, just slightly. She knew. She had seen the fear in Dad's eyes, and now she was testing me, trying to see if I could be broken. But I wasn't broken. I met her gaze directly, my hands clenched in my lap. "I'm not afraid of you," I said quietly, "and I'm not stopping." The look in her eyes flickered with anger, then calculation, then quickly vanished beneath the veneer of calm. She tilted her head as if to study me, then walked away, humming lightly again.
But I knew the battle lines had been drawn. That night, lying in bed, I understood the magnitude of what I had done. I had spoken the truth to my father. I had begun gathering undeniable proof. And Claire had sensed it. Nothing could go back to the way it was. By choosing to speak, I had set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through the family, testing loyalties and courage in ways I could not yet predict. The safety I had once felt was gone, replaced by the awareness that exposing the truth would bring confrontation, escalation, and risk. Yet beneath the fear, there was a quiet, unshakable resolve. Max's death had ignited something in me, a refusal to let lies stand unchallenged. I had chosen to speak, and even if it cost me everything, Dad's denial, Claire's wrath, the fragile peace of home, I could not turn back. The truth was no longer mine alone. It had to be told, no matter the consequences. Claire's first direct confrontation came without warning, a sudden and chilling escalation that left me breathless and acutely aware of how dangerous our household had become. I had returned from school that afternoon, backpack slung over one shoulder, only to find her standing in the foyer, arms crossed, a tight smile plastered across her face that didn't reach her eyes. The air in the room seemed to thicken, each breath I took feeling heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Her presence carried the weight of menace disguised as civility, and I knew immediately that this wasn't a casual conversation. "Emily," she began, her tone deceptively soft, "I hear you've been asking questions, snooping around. That's not nice, is it?" She stepped closer, the scent of her perfume sharp in my nostrils, and my stomach twisted. I wanted to retreat, to put distance between us, but I stood my ground, gripping my backpack strap like a lifeline. "I'm not snooping," I said carefully, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm trying to understand what happened to Max."
I met his glare with calm resolve. What I did was show the truth, Ryan. This wasn't about humiliating you. It was about making sure that people see the reality, not the narrative that's been crafted at my expense. Don't pretend this is about the company's stability. This is about you not wanting to lose control. My words struck a nerve, and I saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. He straightened, his voice rising. "Control? Emma, I was chosen because I earned it. Dad trusts me. The employees respect me. You've always been too cautious, too hesitant, too soft to lead this company the way it needs. I don't know why you're trying to sabotage me now, but it's not going to work. I won't let you destroy what I've built." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they echoed the doubts that had gnawed at me for years, the quiet insecurities planted by being overlooked. But I refused to let him twist the narrative again. "You didn't build this, Ryan. We both did. Every late night I stayed here, every problem I solved, every client I saved, that was me just as much as it was you. The difference is that I didn't need the paperwork rewritten behind my back to prove my worth." My voice carried more strength than I expected, and for the first time, Ryan seemed unsettled. The cafeteria was silent, except for our voices. Employees watched, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Ryan's fists clenched at his sides, his composure fraying at the edges. "You think this is about paperwork?" he shot back. "No, Emma, this is about leadership, about vision. You want to drown this company in cautious decisions and endless discussions. I take risks. I make bold moves. That's why Dad chose me. And deep down, you know I'm right." His words carried a bravado that might have convinced the crowd, if not for the documents I had already revealed. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You're confusing recklessness with leadership, Ryan. Bold moves without integrity aren't vision, they're vanity. And maybe Dad thought he was choosing the stronger leader, but the truth is, this company deserves someone who values more than appearances.
The tension between us was electric, the kind of raw sibling rivalry that had been simmering for years but had never been so public. The employees leaned in, watching not just a family squabble, but the unraveling of an illusion they had been told to believe. Ryan's face hardened. He leaned closer, his voice dropping low so only I could hear. "You think this is about paperwork? You're wrong, Emma. You may have embarrassed me once, but I'll make sure people see you for what you are, an ungrateful sister who doesn't understand her place. You can't lead, and I'll prove it." His words were venomous, and though spoken in a whisper, the weight of them pressed heavily against my chest. For a moment, I felt the fear of being pushed back into the shadows again, of being branded as the unreasonable one. But then I realized something vital. This confrontation was no longer about just me and Ryan. The company was watching, weighing every word, every action, and if I backed down now, I would lose not only my chance at rightful leadership, but also the respect of those who had finally begun to see the truth. So I squared my shoulders and met his glare. "Do what you have to, Ryan," I said calmly, "because I won't back down this time. Not from you, not from anyone." His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he had no immediate retort. The silence between us was deafening, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that the battle lines had been drawn. When he finally walked away, the cafeteria buzzed with murmurs. Some employees looked at me with newfound respect, others with uncertainty. But all of them now understood that the conflict between Ryan and I was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It was out in the open, undeniable, and unavoidable. The confrontation had changed everything. The company was no longer simply Dad's legacy or Ryan's domain. It was now the stage where truth and deception, pride and integrity would collide. And I knew that the real battle had only just begun. The days following the cafeteria confrontation were some of the most tense I had ever lived through. The company no longer felt like the professional, carefully balanced ecosystem it once was. Instead, it had become a battlefield divided into two camps, with whispers replacing conversations and allegiances quietly forming in corners. My confrontation with Ryan had forced everyone to pick a side, whether they wanted to or not. And that choice revealed just how much the foundation of trust within the company had been cracked. I walked through the hallways each morning and could feel the weight of eyes on me. Some nodded in solidarity, subtle gestures that gave me strength, while others turned away, unwilling to be seen acknowledging me at all. Ryan had his loyalists, employees who had benefited from his charisma and promises of promotions, and they clung to him as if their careers depended on his survival. Others, especially those who had long felt overlooked, gravitated towards me, quietly expressing their support in ways that were careful but clear. Still, the division was dangerous. The once united workforce now felt like two armies circling one another, waiting for the next move.
By the end of that night, I understood the cold reality of our battle. Claire had revealed her hand, and the game was no longer psychological alone. It was a direct confrontation. She had sensed the shift, and she was fighting to maintain control. But so was I, and the tension between us had reached its peak. The fight for truth and justice had become inevitable, and I knew the next steps would push both of us to our limits. By the time the weekend rolled around, the house felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing me from every side. Claire had escalated her intimidation tactics, and I could feel the tension radiating off every surface. Her presence had become oppressive, a constant shadow that tailed me wherever I went. She lingered in doorways, hovered just outside my bedroom, and smiled in ways that felt more like threats than warmth. I could see her plotting, calculating, and I felt a growing fear that I hadn't anticipated, a fear that even with the proof I had, I might not be safe. Dad, meanwhile, seemed to be retreating further into denial. Despite having watched the video and seen the evidence with his own eyes, he still hesitated to confront Claire directly. His avoidance created a suffocating silence between us, a quiet that screamed louder than any words.
He tried to act as if life were normal, but his distracted glances and furrowed brow betrayed him. I could tell he was afraid of rocking the boat, afraid of the consequences of acknowledging the truth. That left me isolated, standing on the edge of something I didn't yet have the power to control. That night, after dinner, Claire cornered me in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, one eyebrow raised, her eyes fixed on me with a predatory focus. "You know, Emily, I've been thinking about Max. So sad. Such a little dog. And yet you seem so obsessed with the past. You need to be careful about letting your imagination run wild. Some things are better left alone." Her words were coded in sweetness, but the underlying message was clear. She was testing my limits, trying to see if fear could make me stop. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. I knew she wasn't bluffing. Her calm, controlled demeanor carried a threat I could feel in my bones. I wanted to scream, to tell Dad everything, to expose her completely, but I couldn't. He was still caught in the liminal space between belief and denial. Speaking out too loudly would isolate me further, possibly putting me in even greater danger. I felt trapped in a house where the truth itself was dangerous, and I began to doubt whether I had the strength to carry on. The nights became longer, filled with restless tossing and turning. I replayed every moment, every conversation, every subtle glance, analyzing Claire's behavior for signs of what she might do next. Each analysis brought new anxiety. I wondered if she had been the one to leave Rodentside in reach intentionally, not just for Max, but for potentially for any future disruption. Could she have harmed someone else? Was I next? I questioned every step I took, every decision, every word I had spoken. The weight of the truth pressed down on me, making me feel both powerless and hyper-aware. School offered no respite. Every hallway, every glance from peers felt amplified by the fear gnawing at me. I had shared bits of the situation with Jordan, but even confiding in her only made the danger feel more real. The more I documented, the more I became aware of how carefully Claire could manipulate perception. She had been perfect at maintaining appearances, and now that the cracks were forming, she had intensified her scrutiny of me, ensuring that no misstep could go unnoticed. Even friends at school seemed like potential messengers of gossip, unintentional threats who might reveal my secrets before I was ready. One evening, after another tense dinner, I retreated to my room and collapsed on my bed, phone and journal clutched to my chest. I felt utterly alone, isolated not just physically, but emotionally. Dad's silence, Claire's intimidation, the house's suffocating atmosphere, they all combined to make me feel powerless. The evidence I had collected, once a source of strength, now felt like a burden. It was proof of Max's death and of Claire's deceit, but it also exposed me to confrontation, ridicule, and danger. I questioned whether I had the courage to see this through, whether the truth was worth the risk of losing the fragile bonds I still had with my father.
The storm outside had passed by the time Monday arrived, but inside the company walls, the tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened, clinging to every hallway and every whispered conversation. The threatened contract loss had thrown everyone into a frenzy, and the board demanded an emergency summit to resolve the chaos once and for all. Ryan strutted into the boardroom with the same smug confidence he always wore, his designer suit pressed perfectly, his smile flashing at anyone willing to meet his eyes. But beneath that mask, I could sense his desperation. He needed a decisive victory now, something to cement his claim and push me out once and for all. The client, the company, the family, all of it was riding on this moment, and everyone in the room knew it. I had spent the weekend preparing. While Ryan focused on selling his charm, I had gathered documents, emails, and testimonies from employees who were finally ready to speak out. Karin, despite her fear, agreed to help me, and so did two others who had seen their projects misrepresented under Ryan's leadership. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial, it was undeniable proof of a pattern, a trail of manipulation, credit stealing, and reckless promises that had put the company at risk. Walking into that boardroom,
I knew this was my only chance. If I failed now, I would lose more than my position. I would lose the chance to safeguard the business I had poured my life into. The meeting began with Dad sitting at the head of the long oak table, his face drawn and pale, but his voice carrying the authority he had spent decades building. "This company is on the edge," he said firmly. "We cannot afford this division any longer. Today, we settle this." His words were final, the kind that left no room for delay. The board members, anxious and restless, leaned forward in their seats as Ryan stood. "I'll be blunt," Ryan began, his voice smooth and commanding. "The company's instability has nothing to do with my leadership. It has everything to do with Emma refusing to accept reality. I was chosen by Dad to lead, and since then, all she's done is undermine, question, and stir dissent. Our clients sense this dysfunction, and if we lose them, it'll be because of her inability to step aside. She's the problem, and until we address that, nothing else matters." His words drew a few nods of agreement, especially from the board members who had always been swayed by his charisma. He sat down with a satisfied smirk as though he had already won. But I wasn't shaken. I stood, letting the silence settle before I began. For years, I worked behind the scenes to keep this company running. My dedication wasn't about recognition. It was about preserving the integrity of what Dad built. But recently, something changed. Projects I led were credited elsewhere. Clients I cultivated were promised things I never approved. Risks were taken without consideration of long-term consequences, and when I spoke up, I was told I was the problem. I paused, my voice firm but steady. This isn't about ego. It's about truth. And the truth is, this company is being driven toward collapse by leadership that values image over substance, flash over foundation. That isn't sustainable, and I can prove it. With that, I laid out the documents I had gathered, sliding them across the table so the board members could see. Emails showing my reports, signed under Ryan's name. Contracts he nearly botched by overpromising resources we didn't have. Testimonies from employees who had been silenced or threatened when they questioned him. The room grew quiet, the air thick with realization as the evidence piled up. Ryan's smirk faltered, his confidence cracking as he realized I wasn't just making accusations. I had built an undeniable case. He leapt to his feet, his voice rising in anger. "This is nothing but a smear campaign. She's bitter and jealous because she wasn't chosen. Of course she'll spin things to make me look bad. Are we really going to tear down everything we've built because she can't handle rejection?" His words were desperate, his usual control slipping into fury. The board shifted uncomfortably, the cracks in his facade now visible to everyone. I met his glare without flinching. "This isn't about rejection. This is about responsibility. You were entrusted with something precious, something our family spent decades building. And instead of protecting it, you gambled with it. You manipulated, you misled, and you threatened those who tried to speak up. That's not leadership. That's destruction." My voice didn't waver, and for the first time, Ryan looked uncertain. Dad cleared his throat, his eyes moving between us, torn with visible anguish. "I wanted my children to carry this forward together. I thought naming Ryan would push him to rise and Emma would support him as she always has. But I see now that the cost has been too high. The company isn't thriving, it's unraveling, and I can't ignore the truth anymore." His words sent a ripple through the room, and I felt my heart hammer in my chest. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward.
Claire, sensing the momentum slipping from her grasp, lashed out. "You're both being ridiculous. Emily, you've been obsessed with the dog's death for weeks, and now you're trying to accuse me of something monstrous. Dad, don't listen to this nonsense." Her voice grew louder, more frantic, but the evidence refused to be denied. Dad's eyes, once clouded by denial, now reflected comprehension. The hesitation, the worry, the need to protect Claire. Everything began to dissolve under the weight of truth. Finally, Dad's voice broke through, steady and unwavering. "Claire, enough. I can't ignore this anymore. This is serious. I've seen the evidence and I won't pretend it doesn't exist. We need answers. We need to take the next step." Claire froze, her mouth opening slightly as if searching for a response, but no words came. The calm, collected facade that had protected her for months was gone, replaced by raw panic and disbelief. At that moment, I felt a surge of vindication, a rush of relief I had not allowed myself to feel until now. The confrontation was over, the evidence laid bare, and for the first time, Dad had taken a clear stance. We were no longer facing a subtle, insidious manipulation. The truth had been placed on trial, and the outcome was undeniable. Max's death, once whispered about in private grief, had become a catalyst for exposure and accountability. Claire's next moves were desperate. She tried to rationalize, to charm, to redirect blame, but Dad's focus never wavered. He called the authorities to discuss the findings, arranging for them to verify the evidence and ensure accountability. I stayed by his side, heart pounding, witnessing the culmination of weeks of fear, research, and quiet courage. The house, once oppressive and suffocating, felt lighter. The tension lingered, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that truth had been spoken, witnessed, and validated. As the officers arrived and began asking questions, taking photos, reviewing evidence, I realized that the climax had been reached. Not just the confrontation itself, but the undeniable exposure of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. Max's death, once whispered about in private grief, had become a catalyst for exposure and accountability. Claire's next moves were desperate. She tried to rationalize, to charm, to redirect blame, but Dad's focus never wavered. He called the authorities to discuss the findings, arranging for them to verify the evidence and ensure accountability. I stayed by his side, heart pounding, witnessing the culmination of weeks of fear, research, and quiet courage. The house, once oppressive and suffocating, felt lighter. The tension lingered, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that truth had been spoken, witnessed, and validated. As the officers arrived and began asking questions, taking photos, reviewing evidence, I realized that the climax had been reached, not just the confrontation itself, but the undeniable exposure of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. Claire's reign of fear, which had gripped our household for months, was being dismantled piece by piece. She could no longer rely on charm or coercion. The truth, once hidden in shadows, was now in the light, scrutinized and undeniable. Sitting in the living room, watching the process unfold, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never known before. Every tremor of fear, every sleepless night, every hidden camera and whispered conversation had led to this moment. Max's death had sparked a chain reaction that would change everything. And even as Claire's protests grew more frantic, I knew the battle was over. The truth had prevailed, finally, and the final push had been made. The days following Claire's exposure were a strange mixture of relief, tension, and rebuilding. Dad had taken immediate steps to ensure that justice was served, contacting the authorities and cooperating fully with the investigation. Claire, once the unchallenged presence in our home, now moved through the house like a shadow of herself, her once commanding voice reduced to hurried whispers and angry mutterings behind closed doors. The contrast was stark, almost surreal. Where she radiated control and manipulation, now she radiated fear, her carefully crafted facade crumbling under scrutiny and accountability. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The oppressive weight that had made even the simplest actions, walking through the hall, sitting in the living room, even sleeping at night, feel like a battle had lifted. Dad and I spent hours talking, sometimes sitting in silence, simply processing everything that had happened. He apologized quietly for his hesitation and denial, acknowledging that his love for Claire had blinded him, at least temporarily, to the truth. I should have seen it sooner.
he said one evening, his voice thick with remorse. "But I'm proud of you for standing firm. You had the courage I wish I had sooner." His words were a balm, and I felt the layers of tension in our relationship begin to peel away, replaced by mutual understanding and strengthened trust. Claire's downfall was methodical. The authorities verified the evidence I had gathered, the videos, photographs, and autopsy report, and confirmed that the rodenticide had been deliberately placed. Though her intentions beyond Max's death could not be definitively proven, the negligence and risk she had posed were undeniable. Legal measures were taken to ensure she could not manipulate or intimidate further, and Dad began the process of separating her from the household. The emotional weight of seeing Claire removed was immense. I had spent so long under her shadow that the silence she left behind felt almost alien. But with that silence came relief, and with relief came clarity. In the aftermath, Dad and I worked together to rebuild our home, both literally and emotionally. We repainted rooms, reorganized spaces that had once been under Claire's strict control, and gradually reclaimed areas that felt unsafe. Every small act, pulling the rodenticide container out permanently, clearing out cupboards, reorganizing the kitchen, was symbolic, a declaration that we were reclaiming our environment and asserting that the truth, not deception, would define our home. Each task strengthened my sense of agency, reminding me that courage was not just about confronting lies, but about creating a safe space for oneself in their aftermath.
One of the senior board members, a man who had long been skeptical of me, cleared his throat and spoke. "I've been in this business for 40 years. I've seen leaders rise and fall. And I'll tell you this. I would rather follow someone who works quietly in the background and gets things done than someone who talks loudly and leaves a trail of fire. Emma, you've earned this." His words seemed to tip the balance, and a wave of agreement spread across the room. Heads nodded, voices murmured in support, and for the first time, I felt the board truly behind me. Dad reached into his briefcase and pulled out a set of papers, sliding them across the table toward me. They were the formal documents, the ones that would transfer authority to my name. I stared at them, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. My signature would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It wasn't just about winning against Ryan. It was about stepping fully into a role I had prepared for all my life, even when I didn't know it. With a deep breath, I picked up the pen and signed. The moment the ink hit the page, a quiet strength settled over me. The battle that had consumed so much of my life was over. I had been underestimated, dismissed, mocked, but now I stood as the leader, not because I demanded it, but because I had proven worthy of it. Ryan watched in silence, his face pale, his fists clenched in his lap. He didn't argue further. He didn't storm out. He just sat there, hollow, as though the reality had drained the fight from him. And perhaps that was the greatest defeat of all, not the loss of a title, but the loss of the illusion he had built his life upon. When the meeting adjourned, the board members filed out, some offering me words of encouragement, others quiet nods of respect. Dad lingered, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Emma. More proud than I can say. I should have seen it sooner, but I see it now. You're the one who will carry us forward." His words wavered, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. As the room emptied, I stood alone by the table, the signed papers before me, the hum of possibility in the air. I had won the battle, but I knew the real work was just beginning. There were wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a legacy to honor. But I was ready, more ready than I had ever been. For years, they had mocked me, dismissed me, told me I wasn't enough. But today proved that quiet strength endures where arrogance fails. Today, I stepped out of the shadows and into the light. Not for recognition, but for the future of everything that mattered. The following weeks moved like a storm settling into calm waters, the turbulence giving way to clarity and renewal.
For the first time in years, the company wasn't operating in the shadow of appearances or the chaos of last-minute cover-ups. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness that began to ripple through every department, a sense that the weight had finally lifted. I threw myself into the work not out of desperation to prove myself, but because it was who I was, and for once, people could see it clearly. My new role wasn't about fighting for recognition, but it was about leading with the same steady persistence I had always carried, only now it was acknowledged and respected. The first order of business was addressing the employees directly. I remember standing before the entire company in the largest meeting hall, the same space where Ryan had often strutted with polished words and empty promises. This time, the faces staring at me weren't skeptical. They were curious, hopeful, even relieved. I took a breath and let my heart speak. For too long, we've been caught in a battle of appearances. But this company wasn't built on appearances. It was built on dedication, trust, and resilience. I can't promise perfection, but I can promise transparency, stability, and a renewed focus on what makes us strong, our people. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding, shoulders relaxing, and something remarkable happening. Belief, not in an image, but in a shared vision. Ryan didn't attend that meeting. In fact, after the boardroom decision, he grew quieter than I had ever seen him. He came to the office a few times, his presence a shadow rather than a force, but gradually he stopped showing up altogether. Word circulated that he was considering other ventures, though none seemed to materialize. I didn't gloat. For all the damage he had caused, he was still my brother, and there was sadness in watching him unravel. But I couldn't let his choices drag me back into the bitterness of the past. I had to lead forward. Dad, though weakened by years of strain, began to carry himself differently too. There was a visible pride in his posture now, a softening in his voice when he spoke to me. One evening, as we left the office together, he paused in the parking lot and looked at me with a gentleness I hadn't seen since childhood. "Emma," he said, "you've given me peace. For the first time in years, I don't go to bed worried about whether this company will survive. You've taken that burden and turned it into strength." His words sank deep into me, not because I needed validation, but because they came from the man whose approval I had once chased in silence. To know he finally saw me, not just as a helper but as a leader, was worth more than any title. In the months that followed, the company began to transform. Processes improved, communication became clearer, and most importantly, the employees felt valued again. I made it a point to meet with teams personally, to listen rather than dictate, to invite ideas rather than shut them down. Slowly but surely, morale rose. Clients who had been on the verge of leaving began to return, not because of flashy presentations, but because they trusted us again. We became what we had once been, a company known not for spectacle, but for reliability. Of course, there were challenges. Not everyone adjusted easily to the change, and some still whispered doubts. There were long nights when I questioned if I had the stamina to keep going, if I was truly capable of carrying so much on my shoulders. But then I would remember the battles I had already fought in silence, the nights spent fixing Ryan's disasters without credit, the years of being overlooked. If I could endure that, I could endure anything. And this time I wasn't enduring in the shadows, I was leading in the open. One particular moment stands out, months after that fateful board meeting. A new client, unaware of the internal history, toured our offices. At the end of their visit, they turned to me and said, "There's something different about this place. It doesn't feel like it's run by one person. It feels like it's guided by a vision everyone believes in." That, to me, was the greatest compliment. Leadership wasn't about my name on a door or my face in the spotlight. It was about creating a culture where everyone could stand taller. As for Ryan, I heard from time to time that he was struggling to find his footing. He had been so defined by the role he thought he deserved that losing it left him hollow. We spoke once, briefly, when he came to clear out his office. He didn't apologize, and I didn't expect him to. But as he stood in the doorway, looking at me with something between resentment and resignation, I simply said, "I hope you find peace, Ryan. We both deserve that." He didn't reply, but he didn't lash out either. Perhaps in some unspoken way, he knew the fight was over. The legacy of that battle wasn't bitterness, it was growth. I had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed, but through it all, I discovered the strength of quiet resilience. I learned that true leadership doesn't roar, it endures. And in the end, that endurance was what saved not only the company, but also my sense of self. Looking back, I realized that the years of invisibility were not wasted. They were my training ground, my crucible. They taught me patience, grit, and the ability to see beyond the surface. If I had been handed leadership earlier, I might not have been ready. But when the time came, I was more than ready. I was unshakable. The story spread beyond the walls of our company. Other businesses began to take note of our turnaround, and more importantly, of the way it happened. They saw that leadership rooted in integrity, humility, and persistence could outlast even the flashiest facades. People began to call me not just a leader, but a symbol of endurance. And while titles never mattered to me, the thought that my journey could inspire others filled me with gratitude. In the end, it wasn't about proving Ryan wrong, or even about proving myself right. It was about proving that quiet strength has a place in a world that often celebrates noise. And as I stood in my office one evening, the city lights stretching out before me, I smiled with a calm certainty. I had fought the hardest battle of my life, not with anger or arrogance, but with persistence and heart. And I had won, not just for me, but for everyone who believed that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't shout. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.